Welcome to Coaching with Confidence and Care podcast, inspired by common topics that arise in coach training, mentoring, and supervision. I am Dr. Luba Desamidze, the founder of UpThink Coaching. I'm an active coach trainer, mentor, and supervisor. If you are listening, you're probably looking to deepen your skills as a coach. I hope this podcast will be a helpful resource for you and contributes to your journey. Hi coaches, how's your summer going? I recently finished mentor coaching a cohort of PCC credential applicants, and as we talked about credentialing exam preparation, I thought I'd put together a podcast episode on this topic and share some ideas on how to prepare for that. In addition, you must have seen the news that the ICF is revisiting the credentialing exam for PCC and MCC again, so I think this is a great timing for this episode. Let me give you a quick overview of the changes. The current PCC-MCC Credentialing Exam consists of 78 situational judgment questions based on coaching scenarios where candidates choose the best and worst responses. The best thing the coach could do and the worst thing the coach could do in that particular situation. The redesigned PCC-MCC exam introduces several important changes. It combines 36 knowledge-based multiple-choice questions with 44 situational judgment questions for a total of 80 questions and incorporates the 2025 updates to the ICF core competencies and code of ethics. The exam duration has been reduced from 3 hours to 150 minutes, which I think is great, by the way, including an optional 10-minute break midway through the assessment. Candidates can begin scheduling the new exam from October 9th, with the first testing dates available from November 10th. And during the transition period leading up to the launch, eligible candidates will be able to choose whether to take the current exam or the new PCC-MCC exam. Well, multiple choice questions that are knowledge-based do not typically generate anxiety, unlike scenario-based questions. This episode is being released in the summer of 2026, which means that it addresses the scenario-only version of the exam. The episode will still be relevant after the changes, as the updated exam will continue to include scenario-based questions. In this episode, I'll use the tips that helped our grads at UpThink Coaching obtain their PCC credential. I'll cover preparation from every angle, learning, physical, and mental, as well as spend quite a bit of time exploring the logic behind the exam and the mindset to apply throughout the exam. And for those who don't know, at UpThink Coaching, we have a mock credentialing exam available on our Podia platform, which is completely free of charge. I'll leave the link in the episode description, and I encourage you to give it a go. It can help you develop the discernment that you need to pass the exam. Okay, let's get started. And first of all, I'm going to say, trust yourself and do not be nervous. If you've made it to the exam, it means that you've completed at least 500 hours of client coaching since you started your coach training. Most likely, you've already encountered a lot of those scenarios in your own work. Especially if you have organizational coaching experience, you understand how three-party agreements work and how to navigate relationships with different stakeholders in a coaching engagement. There may be moments of doubt, which is natural, but do not allow uncertainty on one question affect the rest of your exam. Make your best judgment, trust yourself, move through the process. Do not doubt your overall competence just because you doubt your responses to a few questions. Trust yourself and trust your experience. Secondly, check out all the official documents that are available on the ICF website. The ICF Code of Ethics, the core values, core coaching competencies. There are some practice questions available, and as you answer those practice questions, the most important thing that you need to understand is the logic of the exam. Why certain answers are marked as the best option and why certain answers are marked as the worst option. These will be the principles you can rely on. Pay specific attention to core competencies 1 and 2, demonstrates ethical practice, and embodies a coaching mindset, they're not directly assessed during the performance evaluation simply because a single recording may not provide enough evidence. And that might mean that during your coach training or mentor coaching, you could have gotten less feedback on them. Third, let's look at a few practicalities for actually sitting the exam. When I was taking my credentialing exam in the test center, I found the exam not so mentally challenging, but more like physically stretching. I had to sit without moving for an extended period of time, which I normally don't do. And I had to focus for 3 hours. Many scenarios were really long and the time was ticking, so there were a lot of stress factors. Although I did not feel particularly stressed by any one factor, I realized that some of them may have had a subtle, unnoticed impact on how I felt throughout the exam and, in turn, on my focus. As you practice, it can be helpful to recreate exam conditions as closely as possible. That way, you train not only your mind, but also your body for what's to come, and you'll get a much better sense of how to manage practical needs, such as staying hydrated before and during the exam, closing your eyes for a few seconds to take a brief rest, or anything else that you might not know that you need. Be conscious of pacing. Spending too much time on difficult questions can affect completion, and I guess the best practice that I'd love to share is to not allow one difficult question consume excessive time. Keep moving through the exam and flag the more challenging questions or the ones you are sitting on the fence about. Finish the rest of the exam first, then come back to the questions you found more difficult, and in general, understanding the structure of the exam will prevent some stress that may appear. Now let's talk about your approach to taking the exam and the mindset that you'll need to pass it with flying colors. Always pay attention to the ethical component in the scenarios. Is there an ethical dilemma? Is the situation leading to a potential breach of ethical principles? Always go with the most ethical variant or option. It is good to remember that the most ethical option is not based on your preferences. You need to choose the option that is most aligned with the code of ethics. The ethical decision-making is based on professional responsibility, client welfare, boundaries, transparency, confidentiality, and you need to see how that shows up in answers. You will also need to consider conflicts of interest, dual relationships, professional boundaries, especially if you combine different professional identities. For example, you primarily offer consulting services and you do some coaching. When you take the PCC-MCC exam, you only pay attention to your coaching role, so you respond from your coaching stance and not your consulting practice. When it comes to choosing the best and the worst answers, remember that the exam is not a memory test. Always keep in mind what the exam is actually testing. You need to understand the ICF philosophy and approach to coaching. Know how competencies show up in real sessions and have the ability to connect coaches' interventions with the competencies. Practice seeing the relationship between competencies. Do not treat them as isolated checklist items and take time to really understand how they work in actual sessions. It's important to make this connection between the scenarios, the phrases or behaviors that appear in coaching conversations, the core competencies, the exam responses, so that you can recognize how different competencies may be reflected in a single statement or interaction. If you need a bit more support with that, you can refer to demos that demonstrate PCC markers, for example, the ones where markers are explained through evidence in sessions, and I will happily provide a link to one of my own PCC marker demos on YouTube for your reference of how observable behaviors translate into competencies and PCC markers. You can pause after each intervention and ask yourself, so what's the best thing, or what's the most aligned thing the coach could have done? How aligned is this intervention that the coach has done with the core coaching competencies? And the goal here is not to judge others, of course, but to build the discernment that allows you to connect the competencies directly to coaching behaviors and interventions during coaching conversations. So focus on what the coach does, what the coach says, and how the coach interacts with the client. The skill that you really need to train is discernment, and I repeated this word a few times already. The challenge here would be that there's not just 2 options. There are 4 options, and you need to choose the best and the worst out of 4 options, which means that in some cases, you need to compare the degree of appropriateness or the degree of alignment with the competencies. Some options might look similar, and you need to identify what makes one better than the other too, if the worst one is obvious to you. Or what makes the worst one worse than the remaining 2, if the best one is obvious. For that, you need to read each scenario carefully and consider the context before selecting your answer. Consider what is happening in the scenario within the context of the coaching relationship. Think about the circumstances, who the parties are, whether there is a stakeholder, HR, or someone else who is part of the coaching engagement. Do not just latch onto isolated phrases from the core competencies because you happen to recognize them in one of the answer options and think, well, I've seen that phrase before, so this might be the right answer. The exam is testing your judgment, not your ability to spot familiar wording. So you really need to look at this more holistically, I'd say. And for that purpose as well, it's always helpful when you understand how competencies are interrelated and interconnected. Understanding the whole system reduces pressure and gives you a more integrated perspective. The exam checks your awareness of the ICF principles, philosophy, and approach. That is your ability to think the ICF way. It's not about choosing the best option. You need to choose the option that is most aligned with the ICF definition and application of coaching. What does it mean to be the most aligned option? It means choosing the response that best reflects the principles that define the ICF approach to coaching. Focus on core principles and be consistent. Use the same principles throughout the test. Let me get more specific here. Well, as you know, the ICF views coaching as a partnership and non-directive conversation, and it means that the client leads and the coach follows. The coach does not bring their own agenda. A coach does not suggest, tell, fix, or introduce something that's part of their own agenda. The coach partners with the client to support what the client finds most useful. So pay close attention to the language in the answer options. And also the context. If the coach makes a decision without partnering with a client, that is unlikely to be the most aligned response. Another key principle is autonomy. The ICF coaching model keeps ownership with the client, meaning that the client decides what is best for them and what actions they choose to take. Keep the client's agenda central. When evaluating answers, look for responses that honor what the client wants to explore and answers that support client responsibility. Avoid replacing the client's agenda with the coach's agenda. Look for responses that support client's learning because the coach's role is not to provide solutions but to facilitate the client's process. Best responses will show that the coach helps the client discover, supports client reflection, or encourages client learning. If an answer shows a coach giving direction, demonstrating expertise, or solving the problem for the client, most likely those answers are going to be least aligned with coaching competencies. Pay attention to wording because it may reveal the intention of the coach. Partnership means that the coach facilitates and supports the client thinking and development rather than directing the client toward the coach's own way of thinking or what the coach believes is most appropriate or correct. So if you see words like The coach tells, instructs, recommends, interprets, suggests, offers. These answers do not come from a partnering position and therefore may be least aligned with the ICF definition of coaching. Best answers will most likely demonstrate respect for the client's expertise about their own life, collaboration, curiosity, facilitation of client learning, and when the coach assumes ownership of the problem, solution, or meaning, then probably it's least aligned with what ICF wants to see. I'd also talk about presence. Consider the coach's presence as part of a good response. Presence is all about responsiveness. Well, how do we even evaluate presence? We have no way to evaluate a person's presence as they experience it in their body, right? We only see a written extract of the conversation. So coaching presence has to be inferred from how the coach responds to what is happening with the client, not just what the client is saying. The strongest answers demonstrate that the coach is fully with the client, responding to what is emerging in the moment and adapting naturally rather than following a rigid script. Another very important mindset feature is staying client-centered and prioritizing people over tools. A coaching model, structure, or framework is never more important than what the client brings into the conversation. So if there's an answer option that forces a framework, then those answers need to be avoided. The options will also stretch the client a little bit. Remember that the goal of coaching is to move the client beyond what they see about their situation or themselves, which means that strong responses will invite reflection, create awareness, explore possibilities, and they will not impose interpretations, they will not judge or diagnose. If I have to summarize all the principles, I'd probably say 1. The client is always the expert on their own life. The best answers protect client autonomy and support the client's thinking rather than offering interpretations, advice, solutions, or direction. 2. Curiosity consistently outranks assumption. The highest scoring responses stay curious about what the client means instead of interpreting, diagnosing, labeling, or filling in the gaps, even when the coach's assumption seems reasonable. 3. Respect ethical and relational boundaries before pursuing coaching goals. Whenever confidentiality, conflict of interest, informed consent, or coaching boundaries arise, ethical practice takes precedence over maintaining momentum in the coaching conversation. Protecting the integrity of the coaching relationship comes before pursuing outcomes. 4. Work with what is happening now before moving elsewhere. The best responses usually address what has just emerged in the client's words, emotions, or behavior, rather than jumping ahead to action planning, goal setting, or problem solving. 5. The partnership matters more than the process. When there's any tension between following a coaching model and responding to the client's immediate needs, the exam almost always favors stretching the coaching relationship. And this includes acknowledging emotion, checking consent, inviting collaboration, and co-creating the next step rather than rigidly following a process. Well, last but not least, the coach should facilitate awareness, not demonstrate expertise. Many distractor options place the coach in the role of teacher, consultant, mentor, or analyst. These are rarely the best answer. The preferred response will help the client generate their own awareness rather than showcasing the coach's knowledge. What other activities can help you prepare? Well, honestly, I think that one of the best ways to prepare for the exam is through practice. Simply reading the material and trying to process it on your own is certainly helpful, but deeper understanding often emerges through dialogue. After all, that's one of the reasons we do this work, isn't it? We believe that insight is born in conversation. So consider joining a mentor coaching session or a peer discussion where you can review a coaching transcript together and ask, what would be the best response here? What would be the worst? Exploring different scenarios together can sharpen your judgment far more than studying alone. And you can do some brainstorming with your mentor to understand the exam logic better. Well, finally, enjoy the learning. Your coaching experience will really serve as foundation, especially if you've been practicing within the ICF framework, and use the competencies as the guiding principles. Align your existing practice with ICF expectations. Train yourself to recognize the difference between a good answer and the best answer. And during practice, compare why one answer is more aligned. So that's all I had to say for today. I hope that's enough for you to build good discernment and feel confident about your practice. I know examples would be super helpful, so I invite you once again to check out our mock credentialing exam, and you'll find the link in the comments. If you don't find the link, then feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. You could also find as many stories of real practitioners and their experiences of passing the exam as you can learn from the wisdom of your peers. Remember though that all third-party explanations are third-party explanations. Even though we have dozens of coaches who have used our mock credentialing exam and passed, and they told us that they found it super helpful in their preparation process, but even with all the positive feedback, I acknowledge that the mock exam might have some limitations because it uses my perspective and my view on how competencies work. Before we finish, here's a quick preview of what's coming next. In the next episode, I'll talk about coaching courageously and using challenge as a coaching intervention. We'll explore why challenge, when offered skillfully and with care, can become one of the most powerful catalysts for awareness and meaningful change. We'll also look at how to distinguish courageous coaching from simply being confrontational, so you can challenge your clients in ways that strengthen and not damage the coaching relationship. You can expect a new podcast episode every other week. In the weeks in between, we release a new episode of our YouTube series, Conversations with Coaches, where I talk with real practitioners who work with different coaching niches and use various coaching philosophies to explore the choices they make in their practice. If you are interested in developing a more relational, interculturally and emotionally informed approach to coaching, one that goes beyond techniques and tools, our next cohort of ICF accredited training programs begins in the fall of 2026. You can find all the details at UpThinkCoaching.com. I always enjoy connecting with fellow coaches and practitioners on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out and say hello. And if you're looking for a space to reflect more deeply on your coaching practice, I also offer individual mentor coaching and coaching supervision. Thanks for spending this time with me. Until next time, and take good care.